So let's hope that this, if anybody wants to audio record this, you're welcome to. I am at a loss as to why it's not recording on, but I have it set to record, so hopefully it's recording now. Yes. No, and I do have a video. So let me stop share. Okay, so we are recording, and I'm going to hide floating meeting controls. Okay, so today we are talking about the blood. All right. Blood is a connective tissue, but it's a liquid form of connective tissue that lives within the vessels of our body. Okay, it also permeates all of our organs. It's that mysterious vital force. When you go back and you look in the 1800s at these historical medical texts, it's that vital force. You know, somebody would get sick and they would be like, oh, you have too much vital force. We're going to drain off some of your blood. And that's where bloodletting came from. They would drain out those bad humors or that bad blood to get rid of the disease. The study of blood is hematology. Okay. And then recently, within the past 100 years, there's been lots of technology developed that helps to save lives in relation to blood. There are iClicker questions. We are not doing iClicker, okay? We're just, if somebody should be home, but just know that they're peppered through the PowerPoint. So if you want to answer those questions when you're studying at home, great. All right, I'm good with that. And then as always, I have your expected learning outcomes. Not only are they in the PowerPoint, but they're also in the page, okay? Your learning objectives. It's kind of like your study guide. All right, the circulatory system is your heart, your blood vessels, and the blood all packaged into one system. Your cardiovascular system takes out the blood and only refers to the heart and the blood vessels. The functions of the circulatory system, okay? Circulatory system, meaning everything, is to transport nutrients and gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, because they're exchanged, wastes, hormones, and anything else within the blood that needs to medicine, so on and so forth. It also functions as protection. Since it diffuses and permeates through our entire body, it is a great mechanism for protecting ourselves, bringing white blood cells to the area, bringing inflammation, so on and so forth, because inflammation, contrary to what many people believe, is actually a beneficial mechanism within our body. It allows for balance. You get swollen ankles when you've been hiking for a long time, or in my case, when I've been standing for too long. That is a flow of fluid within the body and maintaining that fluid balance. There are two main components to the blood. You have got your plasma, which is the liquid component, and then your formed element, which is the cells. Okay, so because it is a connective tissue, you've got two components to it, right? You've got your cells and your extracellular matrix. Do you remember looking at elastic cartilage and seeing all the fibers? That's your extracellular matrix. Your cells are your chondrocytes that live within that. In the blood, it's your formed formed elements of your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets. So when we look at blood, we know that we can separate blood out, right? You put it in a centrifuge, If you really want to go basic, when I was in high school, the spinny thingy. I use that often, but that's essentially what a centrifuge is. It's a structure that you put the test tubes in, and balanced, when you spin it, it separates out based on the weight of the components. So when you measure this and when you look at it and when you evaluate it, it's called a hematocrit, okay, because it tells you percentage. So when we look at the blood, the liquid portion, which is the plasma, when you separate it out, is the clear part, okay? That makes up a little more than half, about 55%. It's clear. It kind of looks like, has anybody ever actually seen a wheat plant? No? Okay. Wheat is this tannish yellow color. It's actually, when you see it in real life, it's actually a really pretty color. I'm going to say it's kind of similar to the wood, but not really. It's that tannish yellowish color. That's the color of your plasma, okay? Your formed elements is basically everything else. So we have our monocytes, our eosinophils, our small lymphocytes, our neutrophils, our basophils. Those are all your white blood cells. Then you have your platelets, which are your clotting mechanisms. And then you have your red blood cells. That's about 45% of total blood. Haha, yay, I can make that bigger. All right, so when we look at this, we look at this chart, and I'm really hoping that this is recording, but when we look at this, we can see that everything starts from one single stem cell, that hematopoietic stem cell. It gives rise to everything. They go into these things called colony forming units. It's basically this unit that pumps out its specific type of cell. That colony forming unit is where you have the stem cell differentiation. Okay. Remember this chart. It's going to come in handy when it comes time to be able to differentiate, because you're going to need to be able to differentiate the different white blood cells. Okay, and there's very distinctive shapes to look at in those mature cells. Okay, so blood plasma. Being that liquid portion, it's going to have different components that are floating around in it, right? So there's a couple of things that are really, really important. And I'm going to demonstrate this. How many of you have skinned your knee? Like taken the first layer of skin off your knee, been hiking, been riding your bike. I know I have done it dozens of times. What happens when you scrape yourself? Okay, once the blood goes away, yes, there is a lot of blood. Once the blood goes away, what happens? Okay, before it scabs. That's the serum. That's the plasma. It weeps out of, it's the coolest stuff. So when you are, what? Yep, that clear yellow stuff. So this is one of the things I love about kids. And when I was a kid, I was the one that was always examining what I did wrong, what I did to myself. So when you scrape yourself and the blood stops, that means the clotting has stopped, right? You've got the clotting factors. Anything else that remains, that's your plasma. So when you've got a skinned knee and it stops bleeding, and between the time where it stops bleeding and it scabs over and it's weeping that fluid, that is the serum that's coming out of the blood, because it doesn't clot when your blood clots. It stays as fluid. those plasma proteins are really important. So the fluid portion carries the cells, but not only that, it carries the proteins. It also carries gases, and it also carries buffers. But these plasma proteins are really, really important because they do a lot of things. They carry the fibrinogen that is required for the blood clotting. So when you've got the blood clotting and you've got tissue repair going on, the fibrinogen is there and accessible in that plasma for that repair. It's kind of like the toolkit, the body's toolkit. The other thing is you've got albumin, you've got globulins, all different types of carrier proteins that are carrying different requirements. They also are part of the buffer system that helps to maintain our pH. All right. There are 3 categories of these plasma proteins. Your albumins, those are the biggest contribution to our blood plasma. Okay, that is kind of what controls how thick our blood is, how well it moves through our system. If it gets slow like syrup, or if it gets more liquid, more like water. The albumins are what contributes to our blood pressure. Think about it. If your blood thickens up, so say you're dehydrated, okay? Your concentration of proteins is going to become higher, right? When you have a higher concentration of solute within the blood, it thickens up and becomes more viscous. The more viscous it becomes, the higher or harder the heart has to pump in order to move it. The more the pump has to work to move it, the higher our blood pressure goes because it's just not moving. Think about squeezing honey out of one of those honey bears. It's not so easy. But if you think about, say, putting milk in one of those honey bears and squeezing that out, it comes out fairly easily. That's the difference. Because honey is far more viscous than milk is. Your globulins are your protective force, okay? That is what's going to identify and tag foreign invaders. You've got 3 different types of globulins: your alpha, your beta, and your gamma. Yes. So white blood cells are the cells that produce antibodies. We are actually going to go into detail when we go through the lymphatic system, lymphatics and immunity. I would spend time on it, but not in 2 weeks. We're going to be going through it. So you're going to, yeah. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm not saying it very well right now, but I'm trying. Okay. So they're the antibodies. They're just basically the immune tags that identify an invader as non-self, so that the white blood cells can come in and attack them and break them down. We're getting to that. Okay. Your fibrinogen is those clotting threads. That's the toolbox for injury. Any questions here? Okay. Your nitrogenous compounds. So we've looked at the proteins. Now we look at all the other stuff that's in blood plasma, wastes. Okay. Those are your nitrogenous compounds. They are what happens from homeostasis, from the catabolism. That's the side waste. Okay. They travel through the blood and then get filtered out in the kidneys. The kidneys remove them, turn them into urine, and excrete them. We'll get into that with the urinary system. Our nutrients, our glucose, our vitamins, our fats, our cholesterols, all of those things that our body requires for homeostasis and metabolism. And then we've got our dissolved gases, a little bit of nitrogen, but mostly oxygen and carbon dioxide, as well as our electrolytes. Our electrolytes make up most of it. Think about how important sodium is. Most of our energy, in actuality, goes to the sodium potassium pump, right? In the form of ATP. Most of the ATP we form goes to the sodium potassium pump to keep it pumping. If you have a deficiency of sodium, guess what? Your sodium potassium pumps are not going to work. If we don't have sodium potassium pumps working, we don't have energy for our body. Our muscles don't contract. Our nervous system doesn't fire the way it should. Sodium is probably the most important electrolyte. Sodium and potassium equally so, but yeah. All right, viscosity. Went over it. We just talked about it, comparing honey to milk, right? Any questions on this? When we look at blood, when we look at whole blood, like cut your vein, blood is pouring out, okay? It is 4.5 to 5.5 times as viscous as water. So when you look at those old slasher films, how many is likes the old slasher films? Texas Chainsaw Massacre. When you look at these films, the water, I call it water, but the blood is coming out of these people like it's coming out of a fire hose. Come on, people. Let's have some reality here. It's not going to look that way. It's going to shoot, but it doesn't look like it does in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Plasma itself is only 2 times as viscous as water. So that when you skin your knee and you see the fluid coming out of that injury, it flows, but it doesn't flow as easily as water does. It's not like pouring water on top of it, which will just make it sting and uncomfortable, but it doesn't work the same way. So to give you an idea of flow, that's how it goes. Okay. The other part of viscosity is all of those dissolved particles within the blood. All right. The more particles you have, the higher the osmolarity. So this is where we get into that osmolarity. Viscosity is how it flows. Osmolarity is how concentrated it is. All right. Osmolarity, going back to that our buddy sodium, osmolarity is controlled through a combination of those sodium ions, your proteins, and your red blood cells. They all interact to allow for flow. Osmolarity and viscosity go hand in the body. All right, so if your osmolarity is too high, osmo, think blood, means you have too much water. Okay, when you have too much water in your body, what happens to your blood volume? It increases. Why? Good, good. So when, and I'm going to put you in the hot seat, I hope you don't mind. So when your blood volume increases, what happens to your blood pressure? What? Ooh, think about this. Higher volume. It increases your blood pressure. Does everybody see that? It's really subtle. It's a really subtle relationship, but it's so integral. And we're going to be visiting this over and over and over again in the next couple of weeks. So I really kind of want you to be solid on this. When your body fluid increases, okay, that fluid has to go somewhere, right? Well, go back to the original function of blood. That's to help balance fluid within the body. So if you have too much fluid, that means it's going to initially go into the blood to get spread out to other areas of the body. But it initially goes into that blood. The more volume you have in your blood, the more it stretches your heart. The more your heart stretches, the harder your heart has to pump to move that fluid through, which is what increases the blood pressure. Any questions on that? All right. Yes. That's a very big part of it. Yeah. Think about it. When you're increasing blood volume and somebody needs a blood transfusion, what is the condition of their heart? Okay, so let me paint a clinical picture for you, because I actually literally 2 months ago went through this with my mother-in-law. She went into the hospital. She'd been in and out of the hospital for 6 months. They weren't really paying attention to her, dismissed her, oh, go home, take a supplement, so on and so forth. Until finally, the last time she went into the hospital, I said, I'm going with you. I walked in there and they dismissed her. And then I started asking questions. They did a hematocrit and they said her hematocrit was at about a 7.2. At 7, they suggest transfusion. This is what her picture looked like. Her heart rate was about 96. Her blood pressure was 146/30. I see your wheels turning. Yeah. Yeah. No, 146. Oh, I'm sorry. 146 over. At one point, it was 146/130. Oh, you said, I thought I said 30. No, 146/130. So think about what's happening to the heart right now. I'm going to put you on the hot seat. What's happening to her heart? Low blood volume, high pulse. The picture of the heart blood pressure doesn't necessarily look that bad, but it is because there's a very narrow window on that difference. That difference means that there's not enough blood to fully pump. So her heart is not working at optimum. Does everybody see that? Within 2 hours, her hematocrit dropped to a 6.7. Normal hematocrit is a 12. Between 12 and 14 is your normal range. At that point, they said, oh, we're going to do a transfusion. Does everybody see that picture and how blood volume affects the heart? Now, we look at this, you also start to see edema. Why would you start to see edema if your blood volume drops? Yes. Yes. Good. Good thought. Does everybody see that preservation aspect there? The body's trying to increase blood volume or blood pressure. It does it by retaining water. Any questions on that? Did that kind of help explain what this osmolarity and blood volume relationship? Remember, osmolarity is that concentration of proteins and particles. So, okay. So let's then go to starvation. Let's move away from blood volume and hematocrit, and let's go to hypoproteinemia, starvation. Everybody has seen the UNICEF pictures, the heartbreaking pictures of these kids with these super thin arms and these huge abdomens. Breaks my heart. For years, we collected money for food programs. You see this type of image, not only in extreme starvation, but you see it in liver and kidney disease. You also see it in severe burns. Who wants to walk with me on what's going on here? You want to give it a try? Okay. right? So what's happening to the water within the body? Right. Does everybody see that? So your body is retaining fluids because it's retaining any type of nutrients that it can possibly get. So it's going to retain water. Think about the relationship of how water moves through the body. Okay, so your osmolarity means what? Low osmolarity you don't have a lot of those particles that stay in the blood, right? In extreme starvation, what you see is the body is going to take those proteins from wherever it can get it. That's why you see the swollen abdomen, because it's retaining water. But on the extremities, it's eating away at the muscles and bones for the protein that the body needs in order to maintain function. So that's why you see, go back to our friend here, that's why you see such thin legs and arms, because there's just not enough muscle mass there, because the body is robbing from it in order to supply it, okay? And then that swollen abdomen is that retention of water. Any questions on that? Okay, so now that we've looked at viscosity and osmolarity and how that balances and affects the body, and balances and not balance, but affects the heart and heart rate and heart and blood pressure, let's look at how blood is produced, okay? The name for blood production is hemopoiesis. You've got blood that is making its formed elements. That is your platelets, your red blood cells, and your white blood cells. Your daily production is right here. 4 billion platelets a day. Our bodies, our hemopoietic tissues are little production centers of these cells. They originally started from the yolk sac. Okay, that's where your first blood cells came from. They then moved into bone marrow. From the bone marrow, they went to the spleen, the thymus, and the liver. So as an adult, we see bone marrow and spleen still involved in hemopoiesis. Your liver and your kidneys, not so much. Okay, it's only prenatally that you see liver and kidneys involved. Or I'm sorry, liver's involved, kidneys involved to a point. Don't really discuss that. That's more medical school level. And then thymus, your thymus gland. Do you remember looking at the thymus gland? Yeah. Okay, you remember how big it was in a baby and how small it is in adults? At about the age anywhere between 8 and 12, that thymus gland regresses and becomes smaller because it's no longer needed for hemopoiesis. Think about what happens at about the age of 12. You're almost your adult size, right? Think about how much growth a person goes through in their first 12 years of life. It is a massive amount of growth, which means you need to take the resources wherever you can get it to make the blood's formed elements to fill up the blood. Because a baby isn't going to have as much blood as a 6-foot adult. Okay, so there's 2 types of hemopoiesis. You've got your lymphoid and you've got your myeloid. Lymphoid hemopoiesis means the development is happening in that lymphoid tissue. Okay. That is during fetal development. After infancy, it only refers to lymphocytes. And then you've got your myeloid hemopoiesis, which is your bone marrow. So lymphoid happens in the lymphoid tissue, myeloid happens in the bone marrow. Okay, stem cells. These hemipoietic or multipotent stem cells live in the bone marrow, and they give rise to all of the formed elements. So when you have a bone marrow transplant, it's these hemopoietic stem cells that they're going after. They're also known as pluripotent stem cells. So these stem cells multiply in order to maintain the population. They multiply to create these colony forming units, as well as differentiate into specialized cells. Okay, so let's look at these colony forming units that I showed you that picture before. Oh, hold on, how did that get in there? Okay, so we're going to take a step back and we're going to look at red blood cells. But we already looked at those colony forming units, right? Oh, come on. Do you remember that chart that I showed you? You had your hemopoietic. Those are your colony forming units. We're going to go over that, but let's look at red blood cells. Your erythrocytes are your red blood cells. Okay, they're your Smarties. They're thicker on the outside and thin on the inside. They get through all kinds of narrow places. Okay, so they are flexible. They bend, they squeeze, they can form their shape in order to get through capillaries, in order to get through sinusoids and the liver and the kidneys. Think about it. When you're looking at capillaries, and I know I used to do this. So as a student, I would think, oh, a capillary. So yeah, big wide passageway, big wide walkway for those blood cells to get through. It's not like that. It's like a cat getting through a almost closed door. I don't know how cats do it, but they kind of squeeze themselves in. And if they can get their whiskers through something, they can get the rest of their body through something. It's the same thought process with red blood cells. They get into places that you wouldn't even think. Think about the capillaries in your fingertips and how small they must be. So if we look at this, we can see larger capillary. You can see that Smarty shape of the erythrocytes. Have some pretty cool slides in the lab. There's a slide that we will probably be looking at tomorrow that shows clotted blood. But then in the slide, it was also able to preserve red blood cells that hadn't been pulled up into that clot yet. So you can see that shape. It's so cool. You compare the size between the erythrocyte. You see how they can bend. That's one of the benefits of having this particular shape. And then you've got your lymphocytes. Lymphocytes also have the ability to change their shape in order to move into places, whether it be capillaries or into the tissues themselves. Okay. This is where we start to get into blood type. Okay. You had asked about blood typing. You've got your glycolipids and glycoproteins on the outside of the red blood cells. Okay. So you have your antibodies that will go and check those glycolipids and glycoproteins to check to make sure that it's self. The other thing that we see is we see gas transport. Okay. So I'd say the number 2 thing people think of is gas transport. It happens because of the structure of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein within the red blood cell that binds with oxygen. Okay. For every red blood cell, there are 4 heme groups. That means 4 oxygens or 4 hemoglobin can attach to that hemoglobin. For every red blood cell, you have 280 million hemoglobin molecules. Multiply that by 4. For every hemoglobin, it carries 4 oxygen. That is a massive load of oxygen within the body. And it makes sense. Carbonic anhydrase is also one of those forms that allows for transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide within the body. And in the process of that carbonic anhydrase and that bicarbonate, you also have pH balance. Okay, so not only are the red blood cells involved in gas transport, but they're also involved in pH balance. So let's look at this. We have the beta and the alpha heme groups. So there's 2 different types, but there's 4. Each of these groups in the center of it has an iron molecule. So here is your chemical structure. Remember we talked about alpha, beta, and gamma globulins within the blood proteins? As adults, we have 2 beta and 2 gamma chains for our heme groups, for our hemoglobins. But as a baby, they don't have the beta. They only have the gamma. So that's where those 3 come from. Okay, so you've got 2 alpha and 2 gammas in babies or in fetus. In adults, 2 alpha and 2 beta. Your heme groups are non-protein. Remember, you've got 4 heme groups per hemoglobin molecule. In women, we tend to have lower hemoglobin than men, relating to our hormones, our lovely hormones, and our cyclical nature of our hormones. The other part of it is, along with the hormones that control our nature, we also have monthly flow. Our menstruation cycle depletes our blood supply, no matter how you look at it. Okay. When you also look at it, women tend to have more body fat than men, right? This is where you get that. Hematocrit is inversely proportional to your body fat percentage. It's a survival mechanism for women. Yes. Yes, absolutely. It does change with pregnancy. Yes. It is, honestly, it's all within reason. So theoretically, yes, but not always in action. And then as far as pregnancy, the hormones that control pregnancy. So when you look at hormone balance, and again, we're going to cover this in reproduction, but when you look at hormone balance, there's a balance between the estrogens and the progesterone throughout the woman's monthly cycle, throughout that menstrual and reproductive cycle. Progesterone has, when you're looking at the androgens that have an effect, it's in non-pregnant women, it's the estradiol that has the biggest effect. Progesterone just kind of prepares it for pregnancy and then maintains the pregnancy. It's the estrogen. So when you have blood vessels, yes, women have actually higher hematocrits when they're pregnant because there's more blood circulating through and they're producing more. But on the other side of it, progesterone has a control and effect on that blood control and that hemopoiesis. Hemopoiesis refers to all blood. Erythropoiesis refers to red blood cell production. 1 million red blood cells per second. They last about 120 days. Again, we are production monsters on our blood. Though lifespan lasts about 120 days and we produce so many per second, in actuality, it takes 3 to 5 days for an erythrocyte to become fully competent. When they form, they actually have to reduce in size. Okay, so they kind of blow up and then they deflate a little bit. And that has to do with, that's related to that synthesis of that hemoglobin. Okay. And then as well, they also have to increase in number. Everybody see that? That decrease in size is also indicated or also in conjunction with the loss of the nucleus. Our red blood cells are transportation specialists. Okay, they are designed to transport nutrients, mainly oxygen and carbon dioxide. They don't need a nucleus to do it, so the body get rid of the nucleus and pack in more oxygen. They come from the erythrocyte colony forming unit that has control from the kidneys. Remember, the kidneys are involved in erythropoiesis or hemopoiesis. So from the colony forming unit, it then turns into the erythroblast. Okay. The erythroblast is where they are making their hemoglobin, and they are kind of starting to create the ability and that function of gas transport. And then as well as that hemoglobin is filling up that red blood cell, it gets rid of the nucleus. Next, after erythroblasts, we have reticulocytes. Okay, so within the erythroblasts, you have a fine network of that endoplasmic reticulum. This we see in about 1.5% of all red blood cells. So they're kind of like the adolescence of the red blood cells. And they're floating around. And then at the end of that 3 to 5 day period, they are fully formed, mature erythrocytes. Yes.
What happens in a nucleus?
You don't typically see the nucleus ever. If it is, then it's just discarded. The erythrocyte will be thrown out because it can't do its job. More so, if you're going to see an irregularity in erythrocytes, it's going to be in the form of something like sickle cell anemia. Okay, so here is that picture. You've got your stem cell going into that colony forming unit that then differentiates into the erythroblasts. The erythroblasts are like the baby where they're getting their form, and then they turn into the reticulocytes, which are the adolescent erythrocytes. They spend a couple more days until finally at the end of that 4 to 6 day period, they're fully functioning adult erythrocytes carrying the 280 million times 4 molecules of oxygen. Yes. What was that? Oh, the indentation? They don't really have too much in the middle. Really, if you look at it under a microscope, there's nothing there. It's just that transport machine. It's like, so let's compare it to logistics. When you have a truck, tractor trailer, carrying its load, okay, it's designed, that trailer part of it is designed. There's nothing in the middle of it. It's designed for carrying the materials. It's the same thing with the erythrocytes. Okay, the only difference that we see is that when you've got a tractor trailer, at some point that trailer is going to be empty because it's got to go to the next stop. The erythrocytes don't have that because when they go to the tissue, it trades carbon dioxide for oxygen that then carries it to the lungs that trades oxygen for carbon dioxide. And it constantly goes back and back. So it constantly has a full load. Does that make sense? Okay. Iron is hugely important for our erythrocytes. We don't have oxygen binding if we don't have the iron. In my mother-in-law's case, she had an abdominal bleed. So she had been dealing with, and we think it was an ulcer. She'd been dealing with a bleeding ulcer for 9 months before the doctors finally caught it. Men, on average, will lose 9/10 of a milligram of iron each day. Women will lose, on average, 1.9. There is a higher number in women because of our menstrual cycle. They take that into consideration. Iron is not easily absorbable in our body, right? So there's a couple of things that you can do, especially women. Women especially need to take an iron supplement, but men as well, just as important. Always take it with an acidic environment, which means your iron should always be taken with orange juice. Okay. The other thing that you can do is you can look at the supplement and look for a bioavailable form of iron. There's mineral iron supplements that just, it's like licking an iron pan. Oh yeah, they're not bioavailable at all. And then there's the prescription supplements that are more bioavailable. And then you can get into some specialty stores or some specialty manufacturers that have really high quality. Yes.
Some doctors recommend iron, some of them recommend vitamin B12.
For
I guess not blood loss, but what your red blood cell count, I guess.
it really depends on what they're looking at with your labs. So if your labs are showing a low hematocrit and low iron content, then they're going to give you a prescription for an iron supplement. If your iron is normal, that's when you get the vitamin B12 because you're just supporting the function. Yes. Yes, but I have to be honest with you, it takes a lot to do that. And is it iron that you're talking about or lead? I've never encountered that. I've truly never encountered that. More commonly, you're going to see iron deficiency because it's just not absorbed within the body very easily. Okay. And that's, you know, if we look at form and function and we truly take a look at iron, it's really difficult to, you've got to have massive amounts. And I can't even wrap my brain around how you would have that much iron in your system. Like it would either have to be some sort of genetic disorder that will increase uptake or something. Yes.
Do you think that a strict leafy green diet makes you have that much iron? Just like, you know, like in the sense of like carbs, like you can have the high carb intake if you eat pastas every day or eat bread every day. So do you think that could happen with iron as well? Or no?
I've truly never seen that. So you see it, but even though you're taking in leafy green vegetables, you still, it's not a bioavailable nutrient. It's not something that's easily absorbed within our system. There's got to be so many, it's like calcium almost. There's got to be so many things, but calcium is actually absorbed more easily. There's got to be so many things that come into play. Are you looking that up? Yeah. Well, I know that lead poisoning causes purple lips and nails. Yeah, I've never actually seen that. All right, so bronze or gray. That I have seen. So when you look at a patient, and I'm trying to keep an eye so that we can get through this. When you look at a patient that is a vegetarian and eats lots of leafy greens, you tend to see that they are paler, right? That is that grayish color to those high ferrous, but I've never, blue is not. And it just has to do with processing, but it's got to be huge amounts. Yeah, I think it's like 8 pounds of leafy green vegetables a day, which you can't do. Like physically can't do it. Okay, any questions? All right, so dietary iron. It comes in the form of 2 ions, Fe3 and Fe2. You need the stomach acid to convert them because Fe3 is not absorbable. And in actuality, this is where we get into that bioavailable, because most of our iron that we intake is in the form of that Fe3. So think about it this way. You have an upset stomach, you take a Tums, then you go and have a nice leafy green dinner. Are you absorbing any of that iron? No, you're not. From there, if you get to the point where you absorb the Fe2, then gastroferritin has to bind to that Fe2 in order to transport it across the membrane in the small intestine. Okay, and then it's got to go into the blood to bind to transferrin to go into the bone marrow, because it can't travel by itself. In the bone marrow, then it's converted into the hemoglobin and put into the red blood cells. This is where you get to your vitamin B12, okay? When you have a low hematocrit, you want to increase the iron stores. When your hematocrit is fine, that means you need to support the processes for production. Processes such as mitosis, DNA synthesis, and so on. All of those processes require B12. Does that make more sense? And then vitamin C and copper. They're all cofactors. You know, we talk about taking too much. Vitamin C is one of those where you can't, it's a cofactor in almost everything. You can never get too much vitamin C. Okay. Here's the visual of what we just went through. So you've got the iron that you eat. You've got to have the stomach with this acid convert it to Fe3, or I'm sorry, Fe2. Fe2 then goes and gets absorbed into the small intestine with gastroferritin. Gastroferritin is then transported and so on. We also have iron stores in our liver. Our liver will store iron for future use. But when you have a bleed, you tend to run out of your iron stores. Okay, low oxygen. If you, this is so cool. How many of you go up to Flagstaff regularly? When you go to Flagstaff, you have less oxygen available, right? So what you see is you see an increase in erythropoiesis to accommodate for that low levels of oxygen. So let me ask you, when you go up to Flagstaff, has anybody ever gotten a headache the second day there? That is because your body's pumping out more red blood cells to accommodate for that decrease in oxygen. in turn increases your blood pressure, which is what gives you the headache. Isn't that cool that our body can actually control that? I think that's so cool. Sorry, nerding out. So what we see is we see high altitude causing increased erythropoiesis, blood loss, exercise. Why would exercise increase hemopoiesis? Your body's using it faster. Your muscles need that oxygen for contraction, for use. So the more you use it, the more you're going to lose it. So your body needs to increase capacity. It increases the capacity for it by creating more red blood cells. Loss of blood tissue. Why would loss of blood tissue or emphysema, or not lung tissue, I'm sorry. Why would emphysema or loss of lung tissue cause an increase in erythropoiesis? Ooh, dig deeper, please. You do have to work harder, but what's happening? What do we see in our body? Oh no, you're there. You're definitely there. So when your body works harder to get the oxygen, what do we see in our body with oxygen levels? We see a decrease in oxygen levels because our body can't, we don't have the alveoli to absorb the oxygen. So our oxygen levels go down because they're too damaged to do their job. Make sense? Cool. All right, how do we get rid of our red blood cells? Well, we get rid of them through the spleen and the liver, okay? You have macrophages that live, particularly in the spleen, that will digest and dispose of the bits of broken down red blood cells. Okay, so what you see is you see the red blood cell comes in for disposal and they break off those heme groups and they recycle what they can of the cell. All the other leftover bits get digested by macrophages. So you have your globins that recycle the amino acids and the iron is then removed. Heme, when we're looking at those heme groups, in actuality, when you take the iron off of it and when you take the globin off of it, it's a pigment, it's a dye. That is what gives our urine and our feces the color that they have, because it's through that waste process. So that heme was actually converted into biliverdin. That gives a green color. It's like a green dye. And then the biliverdin is converted to bilirubin, which gives a yellow color. Okay. That bilirubin goes into the blood plasma, the straw color of the blood plasma. See how all of this is kind of related? Gets filtered out in the kidneys, which gives the yellow color to our urine. In the liver, the bilirubin is turned in and released as bile into our digestive tract. Bile, in turn, goes through the digestive tract and gives the brownish color to our feces. See how all of that is connected? And then here's just the image of what I just went through. Okay. Disorders. Too many red blood cells is polycythemia. There's primary and secondary. Primary means you've got cancer of erythropoietic and your red blood cell levels go super, super high. Your hematocrit can go up to like an 80%. Huge, huge increase. Secondary comes from dehydration, high altitude, physical conditioning, and so on. That secondary polycythemia is the more natural balancing of the body. Dangers: increased blood volume, increased blood pressure, causing the headaches and those side effects, increased viscosity, and so on. When you have increased pressure and increased stress on the body in regard to normal processes, it puts you at a higher risk for stroke, for an embolism, for a heart attack, because it just means your body has to work that much harder. There are 3 categories of anemia. So let's look at the other side. When you don't have enough iron, it's called anemia. So polycythemia is too many red erythrocytes. Not enough is anemia. Because remember, think this way. You're losing blood that's going to make you anemic. There's 3 different types. You've got your hemorrhagic, which means you're bleeding somewhere. You've got your hemolytic, which means your red blood cells are just getting destroyed as soon as they're made. And then the third one is the inadequacy. Okay, that means the erythropoiesis just is not producing enough. You've got iron deficiency anemia. Okay, so that is an inadequate hemopoiesis. Pernicious anemia is an autoimmune attack of erythropoietic cells. We see it going into your vitamin B12. Okay, your body needs to absorb, right? Vitamin B12 is really important. It's a cofactor for many, many things, integral to metabolism. When our body can't produce metabolism, or when our body attacks those cells that absorb our cofactors, that's where we start to see a decrease in erythropoietic cells. That in turn leads to pernicious anemia. It's actually one of those things that they find. It's one of those signs that they look for on autoimmune disorders. Hypoplastic anemia is slowing of the creation of those blood cells. And then aplastic means it just completely stops. Consequences. Tissue hypoxia. When you don't have enough red blood cells that can carry oxygen, it starves your tissue of oxygen. It decreases your blood osmolarity. When you have a decrease in osmolarity, you have an increase in edema and puffiness. And then it decreases viscosity, which means blood's moving easier through. Your heart has to pump faster in order to keep up with the blood flow. Because your heart is pumping faster, your blood pressure starts to drop. To a point. It's not good. Think about it. It's kind of like, here's a really good analogy for you. Picture yourself in San Francisco on a bike where the pedals turn whether or not you're going. So you have to keep up with it. Going up the hill, it's really slow. Level ground, you hit a nice even. What happens when you go down a hill? It goes faster and faster and faster and faster and faster until you just can't keep up with it anymore, right? That's where you get into tachycardia. Once you start to get into tachycardia, you're at risk for heart attack. Make sense? Okay, sickle cell disease. We're going over this super quick. Sickle cell disease is one of those genetic disorders, okay? Mostly from African descent. It's a recessive allele that changes the hemoglobin structure so that hemoglobin doesn't bind well to the oxygen. The shape makes those blood cells that much more at risk to blood clotting. An increased risk in blood clotting increases so many other risks. So it increases your risk of heart failure. It increases your risk of atherosclerosis, kidney disease, any place where you have blood being filtered in an organ, those organs can build clots. You went through this? Okay, blood types. Here we go, that's what I'm, okay, so this video kind of covers all the blood type in a little bite. And this will be
In a lot of important ways, human beings are pretty similar to one another. But when it comes to blood, there are definitely different types, 8 to be exact. Our different blood types stem from the fact that we all have immune systems, and while they work equally well, they're not all the same. All of the cells in your body are covered in antigens. These are special protein markers that function sort of like name tags, saying these cells belong to you. When your immune system detects antigens that aren't familiar, it triggers the release of antibodies that tag foreign invaders and mark them for termination. Now, there are 2 main types of antigens that form on your red blood cells. They are called agglutinogens. They activate antibodies that smother invaders like a team of rugby players and cause coagulation in the blood. The 2 kinds of agglutinogens are wisely given the discernible names A and B. So your red blood cells could have one kind of agglutinogen, or both, or you could have neither. And if you have any of these antigens on your blood cells, that means you don't have any antibody for it. If you did, those antibodies would attack your own cells. On the flip side, you do have antibodies that would attack the type of antigen that you don't have. So for example, if your red blood cells have A antigens on them, then your blood type is A, and your antibodies would attack type B. If you have B antigens on your blood cells, then you're type B, and you have antibodies for type A. If you have both, you're type AB, and you don't have antibodies for either. And some people have neither kind of antigen. Their genes actually code for an agglutinogen that just doesn't work, and they have antibodies for both A and B. These guys are called type O. Now, just to keep things interesting, there's another set of antigens on your blood cells that works in different ways from the agglutinogens. This is known as the rhesus or Rh system, and it's actually a collection of 45 different antigens, but they're all produced as a single group, so you either have all of them or you have none of them. If your red blood cells have the Rh antigens on them, we say that you're Rh positive, and if you don't, you're Rh negative. So this is how we end up with 8 different blood types, A, B, AB, and O, each with a positive and negative type. Now, when it comes to transfusing blood from one person to another, compatibility is kind of important to preventing a serious, possibly life-threatening reaction. But finding the right match has less to do with which letter you have than which letter you have the antibodies for, which sounds confusing, but let me explain. So type AB people don't have antibodies for either A or B, so they can accept A, B, AB, or O. But type Os have both A and B antibodies, so they can only accept other Os. And as for the Rh antigens, people with positive blood types can accept either positive or negative blood. But negative types are safest taking only negative blood, because while they can tolerate positive blood, they can do it only once. After that, they'll form antibodies against the Rh antigens that they received, which means they can never accept positive blood again. The human body is so weird. Thank you so much for watching this quick question, especially to our subbable subscribers who keep these answers coming. If you have a quick question, let us know on Facebook or Twitter or in the comments below, and don't forget to go to YouTube.
all right. That basically is typing in the short. It's really that simple, but it gets seriously confusing. Okay. So I go into a little history. Carl Landsteiner in 1931, the Nobel Peace Prize, because he was, or the Nobel Prize in Science, because he was able to differentiate these types. Does everybody understand what those antigens are? Okay, they're the lookouts. They attach so that the body can attack. Any questions on blood typing? Yes. What was that? Yes. No. Well, okay. So have you ever heard of an Rh reaction in pregnancy? Okay. That's when the baby has a different Rh than the mom. So mom is Rh negative. Her baby is Rh positive. But the mom's body develops antibodies against the Rh positive blood. Okay, so baby is fine, born, no issues. Second pregnancy, baby is Rh positive. The mother's body will attack the baby and kill it because it identifies that Rh positive as non-self. Do you see that? So you can accept it, you can do it, but you can only do it once. Does that make sense? It's the best way to kind of visualize it. Now, O is the universal donor. Type O blood can give to anybody. but they can only receive type O. Type A blood is the universal receiver. Type A blood can receive anybody's type of blood. See the difference? Question? Okay. It is 1/4 of. If you have questions, email me. I am here. Come on. There we go. Hopefully this will